Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. Did you know you can get Democracy Now!'s headlines and stories delivered directly to your inbox every day? Just text Democracy Now!, one word, no space. Text Democracy Now! To 66866 to subscribe to our daily digest, and you'll never miss a story. Once again, Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866. Thanks so much, and stay safe. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Workers are demanding a voice. We're standing up and we're speaking out for a better life. We're demanding a fair share of the wealth that we help create. We're marching and we're organizing and we're bargaining.
AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka has died of a heart attack at the age of 72. We'll look at how a third-generation coal miner became the most prominent labor leader in the country. Plus, we'll speak to Steven Donziger, the environmental lawyer who sued Chevron for ecological devastation in the Ecuadorian Amazon. After Chevron was ordered to pay billions, the company went after Donziger personally. He's now been under house arrest for 2 years.
The United States cannot become a country that begins to lock up its human rights lawyers, its environmental advocates, its earth protectors.
Plus, we go to Afghanistan, where the U.S. is ramping up airstrikes as the Taliban tries to seize a number of provincial capitals. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In California, powerful winds and dry conditions have caused several wildfires to explode in size, including the massive Dixie Fire, now the 6th largest in California history. The fire north of Sacramento almost completely burned downtown Greenville and has consumed an area larger than Los Angeles. 6 of the largest 10 wildfires in California's history have happened since 2020. Elsewhere in Northern California, officials shut down a hydroelectric power plant at Lake Oroville after the reservoir reached a record low level amidst a searing drought. In Greece, thousands of people have fled their homes on the outskirts of Athens as firefighters from across Europe join crews battling blazes that are threatening the Greek capital. One fire nearly reached the ancient Olympia archaeological site where the Olympic Games were held for over a millennium. Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis blamed the fires on climate change.
Unfortunately, the worst is yet to come, and the night ahead seems menacing. We're talking about unprecedented conditions following many days of heat waves, which have transformed the whole country into a powder keg.
Scores of other fires are raging in Turkey, Italy, the Balkans, Albania, Romania, Ukraine, and Russia. On Monday, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is set to release its first assessment in 8 years. The report from the Nobel Peace Prize-winning agency is expected to contain dire warnings over soaring temperatures, rising seas, and extreme weather around the world. Meanwhile, a new study in the journal Nature finds human activity could soon cause a crucial Atlantic Ocean current system to collapse, with devastating impacts on the global climate system. Researchers found the ocean currents that carry warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic have already been destabilized by the climate crisis. A complete collapse would dramatically change rainfall patterns around the globe, lower temperatures in parts of Europe while raising them elsewhere, and would dramatically raise sea levels in the eastern United States. President Biden Thursday restored tailpipe emission standards set under the Obama administration and later canceled by President Trump. Biden also set a goal of making half of all cars and light trucks sold in the U.S. by 2030 be electric vehicles. Biden made the announcement surrounded by executives and labor leaders of the auto industry.
Beyond the devastation of the lives and livelihoods and the health of our very planet, when I hear climate, I think jobs, good paying union jobs. I wanted the world to see there was a consensus that we're at an inflection point in world history. If we act to save the planet, we can also come out of it better.
Congressional Democrats have drafted legislation that would tax major polluters to compensate for the impacts of catastrophic climate change. The Polluters Pay Climate Fund Act would raise $500 billion over a decade by taxing companies like Chevron, Shell, and ExxonMobil based on the percentage of their global emissions. The fund would help pay for green energy research and to help communities adapt to a warming planet. U.S. coronavirus infections have surged to a 6-month high with an average of more than 100,000 daily cases. In Florida, the Memorial Healthcare System has suspended elective surgeries and has set up beds for COVID-19 patients in conference rooms, an auditorium, and a cafeteria. Florida now faces its worst surge of the pandemic. Even so, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis has refused to reverse his ban on mask mandates, calling vaccinations, social distancing, and masking an individual choice, and threatening to fine any school district that imposes mask mandates. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy will require all K-12 students to wear masks when schools return this fall, reversing his decision last June to drop a mask requirement for schools. On Thursday, Governor Murphy shouted down anti-vaccination protesters who heckled him during a public appearance in Union City.
These folks back there have lost their mind. You've lost your minds. You are the ultimate knuckleheads, and because of what you are saying and standing for, people are losing their life. People are losing their life, and you have to know that.
The World Health Organization warned Thursday the fast-spreading Delta coronavirus variant has led to an 80% increase in COVID-19 deaths across the African continent over the last month.
The third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa is still raging at full force. After a slight dip in cases last week, COVID-19 cases are surging again, rising by 19% to nearly over 278,000 this last week.
Globally, COVID-19 cases are continuing to rise, with an average of over 600,000 confirmed cases per day. The United Nations Security Council is holding an emergency session today to discuss the crisis in Afghanistan. This comes as Taliban fighters are attempting to seize 3 provincial capitals. On Wednesday, a UN spokesperson said the fighting has left thousands of Afghans trapped or fleeing for their lives.
We're deeply concerned about the safety and protection of people in Lashkargah in the south, where tens of thousands of people could be trapped by the fighting. Our humanitarian colleagues also tell us that in Helmand and Kandahar, there are reported increased civilian casualties, destruction or damage to civilian houses, as well as to critical infrastructure, including hospitals.
Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Kabul, Afghanistan for the latest. In Nicaragua, authorities have arrested another candidate in November's presidential election as President Daniel Ortega continues to crack down on his opposition. Berenice Quesada, who was Miss Nicaragua in 2017, has been placed under house arrest. She's the running mate of right-wing presidential hopeful Oscar Sobovado, a former commander for the U.S.-backed Contras, which have been accused of brutal human rights violations fighting the Sandinistas during the Nicaraguan Revolution in the 1980s. In Guatemala, a new anti-corruption prosecutor has been appointed following the abrupt firing last month of Juan Francisco Sandoval, who was forced to flee Guatemala. The new appointee has been accused of prosecuting Guatemala's political opposition and of protecting the corrupt elite. This comes as protests continue across Guatemala this week, demanding the resignation of the right-wing president Alejandro Giammattei and Guatemala's attorney general. To see our recent coverage of the protests, go to democracynow.org. Back in the United States, Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott has ordered a new special session of the state legislature in a renewed effort to pass draconian voter suppression legislation. In response to a previous effort last month, almost every Democratic representative in the Texas House fled the state to Washington, D.C., denying the Republican majority a quorum. Texas Democrats are reportedly debating whether to leave Texas once again ahead of Saturday's special session. Today is the 56th anniversary of the signing of the Federal Voting Rights Act. AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka has died of a heart attack. He died Thursday at the age of 72. Trumka had led the nation's largest labor federation since 2009. Richard Trumka was a third-generation coal miner from Pennsylvania. At the age of 33, he became the youngest president of the United Mine Workers of America, where he helped organize strikes against Peabody Coal and the Pittston Coal Company. He also led union efforts to oppose apartheid in South Africa and backed a boycott of Royal Dutch Shell, which had been called by the National Union of Mine Workers in South Africa. We'll have more on Rich Trumka's life and legacy after headlines. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division has opened an investigation into allegations of abuse, excessive force, and discrimination by the Phoenix Police Department. Attorney General Merrick Garland said Thursday the probe will also focus on accusations that Phoenix officers retaliated against protesters and brutalized unhoused people and people with disabilities. The American Civil Liberties Union has filed a federal lawsuit challenging Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott's executive order restricting some asylum seekers to traveling only with law enforcement officials and directing state troopers to stop vehicles suspected of transporting migrants. The ACLU denounced the policy as illegal and inhumane and warned it will create the perfect storm for racial profiling. A federal judge earlier this week temporarily blocked the executive order until next week, when another hearing is scheduled. In related news, the Biden administration says it will soon require thousands of border agents to begin wearing body cameras. Immigrant justice advocates have long demanded the practice to improve accountability after dozens of fatal shootings involving border agents and mounting allegations of abuse against migrants, asylum seekers, and others. And today marks 76 years since the United States dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 140,000 people. During a ceremony today at the site of the blast, the Japanese Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga, vowed Japan will work with other nations to promote nuclear disarmament. But he did not mention the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which Japan has not signed. Democracy Now! Visited the Hiroshima Peace Memorial in 2014 and spoke to a survivor of the bombing. To see our coverage, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show looking at the life and legacy of AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, who died of a heart attack Thursday at the age of 72. He'd led the nation's largest labor federation since 2009. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced Trumka's death Thursday.
I rise today with some horrible news about the passing of a great friend, Rich Trumka, who left us this morning. The working people of America have lost a fierce warrior at a time when we needed him most. Just yesterday, Rich was lending his support to the striking miners in Alabama. Following in his father's footsteps, he worked in the mines. He went to Penn State, earned his law degree, didn't practice, didn't go to some fancy place, went right to work for the United Mine Workers, which he led for so many years, and then he became first secretary treasurer and AFL-CIO. He had in his veins, in every atom of his body, the heart, the thoughts, the needs of the working people of America.
The Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign paid tribute to Richard Trumka by saying, quote, "We've lost a dear friend and brother in the struggle for justice. He never separated the fight for economic and labor rights from the fight for voting rights and civil rights. He knew they are simultaneous fights," Barber said. Richard Trumka was a third-generation coal miner from Pennsylvania. At the age of 33, he became the youngest president of the United Mine Workers of America, where he helped organize strikes against Peabody Coal and the Pittston Coal Company. He also led union efforts to oppose apartheid in South Africa and backed a boycott of Royal Dutch Shell, which had been called by the National Union of Mine Workers in South Africa. Richard Trumka would go on to serve as Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO. In July 2008, he made headlines when he denounced racism within organized labor and called on all workers to vote for Barack Obama.
There's not a single good reason for any worker, especially any union member, to vote against Barack Obama. And there's only one really bad reason to vote against Barack Obama. And that's because he's not white.
In 2009, Richard Trumka was elected president of the AFL-CIO after the retirement of John Sweeney. This is Trumka speaking in 2018 after the Supreme Court issued a major anti-union ruling eviscerating the power of public sector unions in the case Janus versus AFSCME.
All over our country right now, workers are organizing, and they're striking as we haven't seen in years. 15,000 workers in April, in 1 week, joined the union. And that's on top of the 262,000 new members who joined our ranks last year. And the optimistic, to be even more optimistic, 75% of them were under the age of 35. Our turn's coming. And despite the fact that too many of our labor laws have been written to undermine the freedom to organize. Now, new research from MIT shows a 50% increase in the number of non-union workers who would vote to join a union tomorrow if given the opportunity. Tens of millions of workers are ready to experience the transformational power of collective bargaining. And in many cases, all that stands in the way is a rigged system. Let me be clear. The Supreme Court is on the wrong side of history. What they did flies in the face of where America's headed, where workers want to go and where workers need to go. And it shows exactly how out of touch they are with the real America that's out there. Janus or no Janus, workers are demanding a voice. We're standing up and we're speaking out for a better life. We're demanding a fair share of the wealth that we help create. We're marching and we're organizing and we're bargaining. And we simply will not allow a corporate-controlled Supreme Court to stop us from doing our job.
CIO President Richard Trumka speaking in 2018. He died Thursday at the age of 72. To talk more about his life and legacy, we're joined by two guests. Arlene Holt-Baker served as the Executive Vice President for the AFL-CIO from 2009 to 2013. She was the first African-American to ever serve as an executive officer in the AFL-CIO's history. We're also joined by Jose Laluz, a veteran labor organizer, campaigner, and educator. He's been a workers' rights activist for decades. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Arlene Holt-Baker, you work side by side with Richard Trumka for years. Can you talk first about the reaction to his death and what you feel it's important for people to understand about Richard Trumka's legacy?
Well, good morning, Amy. I am happy to be here to talk about my brother, Richard Trumka. So happy to also be here with my brother, Jose Laluz. The reaction, and it it has been devastating for us. I think you heard it in the emotion of Senator Schumer's voice. We were broken by the news. But if you knew anything about Rich Trumka, it could only bring a smile to your face, because he's the brother in our movement who fought in so many ways for what is right. My own reflection is, you start to think about the last time you saw him or spoke to him. And I thought about the last time I actually saw Rich, and it was on Facebook, and because he was doing a speech at the AFL-CIO where he had welcomed the Texas delegation to come. And he stood with them as he talked about the right to vote. And he talked about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and For the People's Act. And then he connected all of that to the PRO Act, which is the right for workers to organize. And Rich truly believed, as all of us in the labor movement believe, that you can't have the denial of voting rights and suppress the votes of anyone and not have a strong labor union without destroying your democracy. Rich understood that democracy was on the line. So I thought, Rich, the last time I heard him, he was giving the same message that I've heard him give for so many years. It was about empowering workers and empowering our communities.
Let's go to a bit of that speech that you're describing, Arlene, the speech Richard Trumka gave in Washington, D.C. in July.
And we cannot afford to let any of our agenda, from democracy in the workplace to democracy at the ballot box to investment in our people, fall victim to a procedural tool conceived in segregation. It's become clear that one of two things must be pushed aside: the filibuster or the hopes and aspirations of the American people.
That speech Richard Trumka gave in July. Arlene Holt-Baker, talk about your rise with him. In 2009, we played in the introduction here that speech that he gave addressing the labor movement and addressing the issue of racism within the labor movement as he was campaigning for Barack Obama to become the first African-American president of the United States. Then you became the first African-American executive within the AFL-CIO, becoming the executive vice president for the Federation. Talk about that time.
Well, I have to reflect back, Amy, to 1995, when the New Voice team of John Sweeney, Linda Chavez Thompson, the first woman, Latina woman to be elected, and Rich Trumka, the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, ran on a ticket in 1995 talking about inclusion and diversity and a new voice for workers around this country, understanding the importance of diversity in the labor movement. I was very, honored because in 2007, I was appointed by John Sweeney to serve out Linda Chavez Thompson's term when she decided to step down from her position, and I served in that position. But it was in 2009 through 2013 that I served alongside Rich Trumka as his executive vice president. And during that period of time, history was also made because we know so many things were happening in the country, particularly the election of Barack Obama. We were pushing for that. But Rich Trumka understood that you could not be silent. You could not be silent when it came to race. And his boldness when he stepped out and he spoke to a convention in 2008 and put it all on the line that says that if you are not willing to vote for this man, who certainly is supportive of workers' rights and everything we believe in, it is only can be chalked up to racism. The boldness, the willingness to speak truth to power no matter where it was, and to speak truth to our unions. The other piece of this I think that's important is that Rich understood that the diversity of the labor movement had to be reflected and must be reflective of our membership, and that's women and young people and people of color. So on that team also was Liz Shuler, the first Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, a young woman. So the Rich Trumka team was a team representative of the future of the labor movement if we were going to continue to grow and be empowered, but most importantly to empower working people. It was a wonderful, exciting time, and it was wonderful to be on the side and standing with Rich Trumka as we continue to forge a path that included diversity, inclusion, and, my God, organizing.
I want to bring Jose La Luz into this conversation, veteran labor organizer, campaigner, educator. He's been a workers' rights activist for half a century in the mainland United States and Puerto Rico and through the Western Hemisphere. Jose La Luz, can you describe your response when you heard the news of Rich Trumka's sudden death yesterday? And can you talk about his legacy?
Indeed. Thank you for having me, Amy. First of all, my deepest condolences to his wife, Barbara, and his son, Richard, and his grandchildren. This has been a significant loss for American workers, no doubt. And I think it's important to take a moment to understand who was, in fact, Richard Trumka as a trade unionist. He came out of the mine workers. He was a reformer in the mine workers. This is the union that had been led by John L. Lewis, the founder of the CIO that organized the mass industries in America. But it was also the union that became infested with corruption. Tony Boyle, who ordered the execution of Jack Jablonski, and the emergence of the rank-and-file caucus known as the Miners for Democracy. Trumka came out of the reform tradition, the militant reform tradition of the mine workers, which is the reason why he led that strike of the, against the Pittston coal, mine company. And so when he was elected as part of the slate, of the New Voice slate, as my friend and sister Arlene was talking about in 1995, those of us who see ourselves as reformers, as militant reformers in the, trade union movement, had a lot of hope. For this coalition that came together around John Sweeney, Richard Trumka, and Linda Chavez Thompson, in terms of dealing with this fundamental challenge that the American labor movement has, and that is how to build power for workers, how to build political power, how to build economic power, how to become a very strong force for a profound transformation in society. And so Trumka was, in fact, a reformer and a visionary. And in that sense, this is a great loss. But much has been left undone. And now, his legacy must be, lived up by whoever, emerges as the leader or the new team of leaders of the only labor federation in this country, to deal with this challenge of how to build, power for workers, when in fact what we have witnessed in the past few decades is a massive distribution of wealth from the bottom to the top. Workers losing power, political power, and power in society. And so this remains a fundamental challenge for whoever is going to, take up the mantle and try to live up to the legacy of Brother Trumka.
Where do you think the labor movement and the AFL-CIO needs to go now? What do you think, José La Luz, that the AFL-CIO needs to gain more strength for workers?
One, the challenge of organizing. When you represent only 10% of the labor force, I mean, it's hard to envision being able to exercise a lot of power. I mean, the labor movement must grow, and this means that the resources have to be allocated, have to be invested in organizing. And there have to be, massive campaigns that are coordinated among different unions that are done by industries, because one of the weaknesses of the American labor movement has to do with the fact that it's not organized industrially like it is in many other advanced, capitalist countries across the Atlantic, in Europe, and even in other countries. So the question of organizing by industries is going to require a new architecture for the American labor movement, and the Federation has to lead in terms of that. And in terms of political action, there is a need to develop a new strategy that's far more independent from the Democratic Party. I mean, it's important to realize that there are elements in the Democratic Party that are supported by corporate donors and really, don't have a very, serious commitment to empower, workers and the working class. On the other hand, there are, people, within the Democratic Party who see themselves as working class advocates who fight, for the rights of workers and to build power, for and by workers. And so, this will be one of the challenges that the new team that takes over the reign in the Labor Federation is going to have to wrestle with, not to mention, the challenge of trade and development. I mean, we're dealing with a globalized work. There is a need to develop alliances across borders, and immediately, the question of building strong alliances with Canadian workers up north, with Mexican workers down south, to deal, with the fact that we continue to witness, runaway capital, which, impacts jobs in this country. But the question is, how do we develop a strategy that raises the standard of living for workers in McAllen, for workers in Matamoros, and for workers in Toronto? And so that requires an alternative economic, development, trade, strategy. And those are the challenges that I see ahead for the new team emerging at the helm of the Labor Federation.
Before we go, Arlene Holt-Baker, I wanted to ask you about the PRO Act. That's the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which did pass the House, which sits in, the Democrats do control the Senate, still sits in the Senate since March. Richard Trumka was a major advocate of this act. Can you talk about its importance?
It is critically important. It is so important because workers want to organize. There's no question about that. They want to have a voice at work. And the PRO Act will make it possible for workers to do so without being intimidated, harassed, fired, and the company would be penalized for that. So the PRO Act is critically important now. We have to have workers be able to freely have a voice on their job. If they aren't able to do that, they will not be able to reach the economic conditions that they so need in order to survive. Power, yes, it comes from the ground up from workers, but unless they have that voice on the job, free of intimidation, harassment, and free of having to sit in captive audience meetings held by their employers, they will not be able to fully see the potential of their work. So the PRO Act is critically important. As I indicated earlier, that was one of the last things I heard Rich talking about, connecting voting rights and voter suppression and the PRO Act together, because we must empower workers' voices on the job. We must continue to empower the voter in this country so that we can be sure that our democracy holds strong. So the PRO Act is critical to us. And I would say to the senators, all of the senators who are listening, it's not enough for you to just talk about and give accolades to Richard Trumka. If you really want to show how much you truly care about Richard Trumka and the workers that he cared so much about, I would say pass the PRO Act. Pass it now, Senate. And I would say pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act now. Enough talking. That's what Rich would say. Rich would say enough talking, because the word Rich would want to give you, that workers, we are never, ever, ever going to back down.
Arlene Holt-Baker, Executive Vice President for the AFL-CIO from 2009 to 2013. She was the first African-American to ever serve as an executive officer in the AFL-CIO's history. And I want to thank Jose La Luz, veteran labor organizer, campaigner, and educator. Coming up, we go to Afghanistan, where the U.S. is ramping up airstrikes as the Taliban tries to seize a number of provincial capitals. Stay with us.
The sun comes up about 10 in the morning and the sun goes down about 3 in the day. Fill your cup with whatever bitter brew you're drinking, and you spend your life just thinking about how to get away. Was cold in them mountains till a man from the northeast arrived. He waved them $100 bills, said I'll pay you for your memories, and he never left Harlem.
You'll Never Leave Harlan Alive, performed by Jan Bell. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Afghanistan. The United Nations Security Council is holding an emergency session today to discuss the ongoing crisis in the country. This comes as Taliban fighters are attempting to seize 3 provincial capitals, Kandahar, Herat, and Lashkar-Gah. The Taliban has also taken responsibility for a major attack Tuesday outside the home of Afghanistan's defense minister in Kabul that killed 8 people, though not him. On Thursday, the European Union condemned the recent Taliban offensive and demanded, quote, an urgent, comprehensive and permanent ceasefire, unquote. In recent days, the United States has stepped up airstrikes targeting the Taliban in an effort to support the Afghan military. This all comes as the United States is on pace to withdraw its ground troops by the end of August. We go now to Kabul, where we're joined by the journalist Matthew Akins. He is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. In 2013, he won a Polk Award for exposing U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. He has a book coming out on refugees in February. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Matt. It's great to have you back. Matthew, if you could start off by describing the situation on the ground as what I believe the U.S. now says they've pulled out 95% of their troops.
Thank you, Amy. It's always a pleasure. Well, in the 13 years I've been working here, I've never seen a situation as grim. Kabul has been quiet for the last few months. That was shattered a couple days ago with this massive suicide attack. The provinces are falling to the Taliban. There's a number of provincial capitals that are encircled. Just today, this afternoon, in fact, we had news that the Taliban have taken over Zaran, which is the capital of Nimroz province in the southwest of the country. It's a strategic province in terms of its borders with Iran and Pakistan. And the Taliban have entered the city. We are seeing images of that now, and it's the first time that they've seized a provincial capital. since the fall of Kunduz in 2015, when the government was able to take it back with U.S. Help, including troops on the ground. So it's a very significant moment, and the bad news just seems to continue.
Can you talk about who the Taliban are?
The Taliban are a rurally based insurgency. I mean, at this point, they're setting up an alternative government to the Afghan state in their territories. They want to establish an Islamic system, an Islamic emirate. They claim to be fighting to be removing foreigners from their country, the foreign troops, foreign occupation. So they call themselves the Mujahideen, which is the same name, of course, that was used by fighters against the Soviet occupation in the 1980s.
So talk about the areas of the country that they have control of, and talk about Kabul, and also the significance of this latest attack that the Taliban has taken responsibility for outside the defense minister's home.
Well, up until now, the Taliban have largely controlled rural areas, and that really has to do with a split between Afghanistan's cities and its countryside. The cities have benefited a lot more from the last 20 years of foreign military and development presence, whereas the countryside, they've borne the brunt of the violence, and they haven't really benefited as much from development. So you've seen this rural-urban split. The Taliban have captured a lot of these districts. Now they're trying to encircle cities, and it's going to be a much harder battle for them because they have less support there, and the government now has fallen back upon its centers where they have less problems about logistics. They're also getting support from American airstrikes, which have been stepped up in recent days. I think one reason is because American troops are largely out of the country now, so there's less targets for the Taliban to retaliate against. Instead, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be hitting the cities. They're going to be hitting government targets in the cities like the defense minister's house, which was hit by a massive suicide bombing, as well as a member of parliament next door. Apparently, there was 100 people meeting in that parliamentarian's house, and it was very lucky that they were able to actually escape onto the roof where there was a sort of bridge to a neighboring house. So only 8 people were killed, but it could have been an incident with much higher casualties, and we're likely to see more of that as the Taliban start to retaliate and bring pressure on the internationals and the government in response to these airstrikes.
So the UN is meeting now to deal with this issue. The UN warned in a new report that civilian casualties in Afghanistan in the first half of 2021 reached record levels, including a sharp increase in killings and injuries since May, when the international military forces started pulling out. Without a significant de-escalation in violence, the report says, Afghanistan is on course for 2021 to witness the highest ever number of documented civilian casualties in a single year since the UN records began. So can you talk also about the effect of the U.S. air attacks? They say they're supporting the Afghan military. They've intensified recently, and are they going to end by the end of August?
Well, so far, the Biden administration has not said whether they're going to end by the end of August. They're reserving that right. And these airstrikes are happening now inside of cities because the Taliban are inside cities. They're in the outskirts of many of these provincial capitals. So they're striking buildings, they're striking heavily populated areas, a lot of civilians. So there are undoubtedly going to be heavy civilian casualties as a result of this urban combat. Also on the side of the Taliban, who are, after all, responsible for these offensives into cities. So the blood of a lot of civilians are going to be on their hands as well. The fact of the matter is if these provincial capitals fall, it might also be quite bloody. It's a kind of no-win situation. I think maybe similar to what the U.S. faced in Iraq, where airstrikes were necessary to hold back the advance of insurgents from capturing major cities. But at the end of the day, there's very little leverage that the international community of the U.S. has on the Taliban. We've been bombing them, assassinating them, sanctioning them for 20 years. So as long as they're winning, capturing territory, they have no incentive to come to the bargaining table. So probably we're going to see brutal, bloody fighting until there's a stalemate of some sort that persuades both sides to talk. And I'm afraid we're quite far away from that. And we're going to see increased civilian casualties and also a massive wave of displacement. There's going to be Afghan refugees who are going to be leaving, or are leaving already in heightened numbers for neighboring countries. And ultimately, some of them are going to try to reach Europe.
And what will happen with them?
Well, it's sad to say because I covered the major wave of displacement of people who are crossing in rubber rafts, across the Mediterranean in 2015, 16. They were walking across the mountains and deserts to get there. And since that refugee crisis, what we've seen is these countries have actually hardened their borders. They've built fences, they've built walls, they've built concentration camps with the support of the European Union, just like the U.S. has fortified its southern border. So the way is going to be a lot harder, a lot more brutal for these people who are fleeing this disintegration of their country.
You've reported extensively on U.S. war crimes and committed in Afghanistan, and the longest U.S. war in history. Can you talk about the legacy of the U.S. invasion and what the United States military leaves in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the military was very focused on short-term solutions. There was this adage that we didn't fight, 20-year war. We fought 21-year wars. With each new troop rotation, people were looking to make solutions that would last the end of their deployment. So it's kind of no wonder that things are falling apart so quickly because nothing was made to last, really. And so that's one legacy. The other is that there have been quite brutal human rights abuses and extrajudicial killings committed by Afghan security forces in Kandahar right now. The Taliban have captured areas like Spin Boldak. They are definitely carrying out extrajudicial killings. There's been evidence. I've heard that from my sources. Many of the people they're targeting are former members of the government security forces, police belonging to General Abdul Razak, a commander that I reported on, whose men were engaged in documented extrajudicial killings. So this cycle of violence, this cycle of war crimes is continuing, it's accelerating, and I fear that in the coming months and years that we're going to see a return to the kind of open, widespread massacres and violations of rights that we've seen in previous years during the Civil War.
Although we say U.S. troops are out of Afghanistan within weeks, in fact, thousands of mercenaries will remain there and other what the U.S. calls support staff. Is this war just going to become much more secret and much more even less accountable than it is?
I think that the U.S. role in this war is definitely going to become more secret and less accountable because it's going to be largely carried out by the CIA and special operation forces that are operating under secret, covert authorities. So we're going to know less about it, certainly. And at the same time, though, I think that it's going to become a much more Afghan war. There's not going to be the same presence that we had before. So it's very difficult to say what the U.S. will be doing because we're not going to have a lot of visibility on it. It's going to be a much smaller role, but significant nonetheless. I mean, don't forget that they're bankrolling the Afghan government, paying their salaries. And without that, there would be an even faster collapse of the Afghan security forces.
And what do you think that the U.S. media, of the U.S. media portrayal of what's happening in Afghanistan right now, what's missing, Matthew?
I think that there is a lack of recognition that what we're seeing now is the consequence of 20 years of bad decisions, of ignoring corruption and human rights abuses, and for all the violations of human rights, the murders, the massacres that the Taliban are undoubtedly carrying out, the violence that they're inflicting on Afghan civilians, the suffering that their offensive is bringing, the threat that they're going to pose to civil society activists, freedom of speech, media, all of which is absolutely real and very condemnable. It is the result of 20 years of violence inflicted on the Taliban in the rural areas, 20 years of interlacing the media and the civil rights, civil society here with this military presence so that they become kind of indistinguishable in the eyes of the Taliban. And so what we're seeing now is the result of 2 decades, and it's going to be very difficult to turn that ship around. We're going to be witnessing some very awful things, but we should try to keep the context in mind while still condemning them.
Well, Matthew Akins, I want to thank you very much for being with us, speaking to us from Kabul, Afghanistan, contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. Coming up, we will speak with human rights and environmental lawyer Steve Donziger. He took on Chevron for polluting the Ecuadorian Amazon. Today marks year 2 years since he's been under house arrest. You'll find out why. Stay with us. Ghost 28 by 9 Inch Nails. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. If you'd like to get our daily digest, you can get it emailed by texting the word Democracy Now! One word to 66866. That's Democracy Now! To 66866. Protesters are rallying in several cities today to call for the immediate release of environmental and human rights lawyer Steven Donziger, who's been held under house arrest in New York for 2 years after being targeted by the oil giant Chevron. The case stems from Donziger's role in suing Chevron on behalf of 30,000 Amazonian indigenous people for dumping 16 billion gallons of oil into their ancestral land in the Ecuadorian Amazon. 10 years ago, Ecuador's Supreme Court ordered Chevron to pay $18 billion. The landmark ruling was seen as a major victory for the environment and corporate accountability. But Chevron refused to pay or clean up the land. Instead, Chevron launched a legal attack targeting Donziger. Last month, a federal judge found Donziger guilty of 6 counts of criminal contempt of court after he refused to turn over his computer and cell phone. In an unusual legal twist, the judge appointed a private law firm with ties to Chevron to prosecute Donziger after federal prosecutors declined to bring charges. Today marks 2 years, 730 days since Steve Donziger has been in house arrest. Steve Donziger joins us from his New York home. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!, Steve. If you can start off by speaking about the trial that just took place. We talked to you right before the trial. You've since gone to trial and been found guilty. But talk about who prosecuted you and what the courtroom and the trial were all about.
Thank you, Amy, for having me. It wasn't a trial as trials are commonly understood. There was no jury. The judge who had already locked me up pre-trial, I'm the only lawyer in American history ever locked up pre-trial on a misdemeanor. I want to emphasize this is a misdemeanor case, a petty crime case, and I assert my innocence. But even if I were guilty, it's a very minor case. No one's ever been locked up pre-trial but me. So the same judge who locked me up now for 2 years, I haven't been sentenced to anything, is the judge who denied me a jury and alone decided my supposed guilt or innocence. It was intended really to be sort of a show trial where a decision that had previously been made by the Chevron prosecutor, the Judge Preska, allowed a private law firm, Seward and Kissel, which has Chevron as a client, to prosecute me after the government refused to prosecute me. It was all just pre-cooked, and you kind of felt it watching it in the courtroom. During the trial, Judge Preska was reading the newspaper during witness testimony. All the main witnesses were Chevron lawyers. They testified that Chevron had paid them Chevron private lawyers from a second law firm, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. Chevron had paid them $1,300 an hour and more to help the other Chevron private prosecutor try to convict me. It was all kind of run by Chevron. And the dangerous part about this, beyond the fact that my liberty has been deprived and I've been unable to work and help my clients in Ecuador and do my human rights work, is that this is a broader threat to our society. I mean, we cannot allow in any rule of law country or any country private prosecutions run by corporations. It's just extraordinary. You know, if this were run by a normal prosecutor, the case never would have happened, or at a minimum, I never would have been, locked up prior to trial.
Well, I mean, the federal prosecutors refused to prosecute you. Is that right?
That's exactly right. What happened was, underneath all of this is the fact that I worked on a team of lawyers for years to hold Chevron accountable for the Amazon Chernobyl, this massive, deliberate dumping of cancer-causing oil waste down in Ecuador where indigenous groups have been decimated. And Chevron wanted that trial held in Ecuador's courts, and we fought for 8 years against Chevron, won this big judgment in 2011. And rather than pay the judgment, they decided to try to demonize me and try to criminalize lawyering, criminalize human rights lawyering. They've had this plan for 10 years. We know for a fact, and they've admitted it, that way back in 2010, they went to the SDNY, which is the federal prosecutor in Manhattan, seeking to prosecute me for this supposed fraud in Ecuador, which is just hogwash. And they refused to prosecute me then. And, I kept going along with other lawyers to try to enforce the judgment against Chevron that we had won in Ecuador, which, by the way, has been affirmed by 6 appellate courts in Ecuador and Canada. I mean, this is a real judgment. And they then went back to this U.S. federal judge, Judge Lewis Kaplan, who's a former tobacco industry defense lawyer, and got him to demand I turn over my computer and cell phone and electronic devices to Chevron. Again, no one's ever heard of such a thing in the middle of a litigation. When I appealed that order, he then charged me with criminal contempt of court for appealing the lawfulness of his own order. No lawyer in American history who's appealed a civil discovery order in this fashion has ever been charged with criminal contempt but me. No lawyer charged with any criminal contempt in New York has ever been held pre-trial, and the longest sentence ever given a lawyer convicted of this supposed crime is 90 days of home detention, and I've now been over 8 times that amount in my home. So what's really driving this, Amy, is I believe Chevron and its judicial allies want to, A, protect Chevron from having to pay the liability to the people of Ecuador that the company poisoned, and B, they want to send a larger message to lawyers and the legal profession and environmental defenders and water protectors that you're not allowed to do this work, at least not at this level. You will be attacked, and we'll throw everything we can at you. And by the way, Chevron has used 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers to target me.
So you are sentenced to 6 months in jail, 6 months more?
Yeah, so Judge Preska, who's driving this, has set a sentencing date for October 1st. I'm very fortunate because there's a massive amount of support, as you acknowledge in the openings, to this segment, growing around the world. We have rallies today in 15 cities around the world demanding my release, including Seattle, San Francisco, LA, New York, Boston, Toronto, Tel Aviv, and Quito, among them, Melbourne. So, we are building a movement to, not only demand my release and to protect the freedom of me and my family, but also to protect this idea that you can do corporate accountability lawyering and not be attacked by, right-wing judges and corporations that can take over the public machinery of the prosecution. This is a serious issue. Like having a corporation prosecute someone and have the power to deprive someone of their liberty in the United States can't happen. This is the first time. And of course, if they get away with it with me, this, I believe, is a part of the playbook of the fossil fuel industry to do this to other activists and lawyers.
Well, Steve, we want to thank you for being with us. 6 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, including AOC, Cori Bush, Rules Committee Chair Jim McGovern, and others, Jamie Raskin, have called for the DOJ to review everything that's happened to you. Steve Donziger, human rights lawyer who successfully sued Chevron in Ecuador for dumping oil and toxic waste in Amazon. He's been under house arrest for 2 years today. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe.